Hello, everyone. Welcome to this awesome opportunity that we have with the New Ulm Public Library to to speak to author Samantha Specks about her new book that has just come out. We're very excited. I had the chance to read it in advance. I feel special now. But we're excited to have this opportunity to sit down and talk to her more about the book and about her as an author. So welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
And so where are you joining us from?
I'm currently in Wayzata, Minnesota. Yes, I live in Texas, but I've been in Minnesota quite a bit this summer, and my parents are helping with the baby, and obviously a lot of the books.
Exciting.
Awesome to be back.
All right. So, that's a great segue. So in the book, you mentioned several times your own connections to New Ulm. So could you tell us more about that?
Yes, yeah. So my parents both graduated from New Ulm High School, and both sides of my family still live in the area. And my fondest memories of growing up probably are both in Cortland and New Ulm. And yeah, so just have always known the area and gone back regularly, even as an adult.
Great.
I'm a big fan of Shell's Oktoberfest beer.
A couple more months, and hopefully with COVID, everything it'll be able to happen. But,
yeah.
So when did you first become interested in writing?
Oh, interested in writing. I've always been a reader for sure. And that's just always been my lifelong passion. I've always been that girl carrying books with me from class to class and reading those in between during passing time in high school and middle school. And then the writing piece has kind of just been more of a hobby and an interest in something that I've done in my academic studies and during my master's program. And then this book, honestly, just started as a story in my brain. And as I was so interested in this topic of the US-Dakota War of 1862, I just started to see it through the history through the lens of story. And somehow I've gotten myself into writing a whole book from that interest. So I don't really think of myself as a writer, but I sure love a good story.
Right. So in the book, you share about an experience you had with your grandparents in the winter in which you saw the Dakota Memorial Riders. Can you tell us a little bit more about that experience and how it stuck with you and in part brought about this book?
Sure. So my interest in this topic of the US-Dakota War of 1862 started when I was in high school. From an actual event when I was driving to my grandparents' home in Cortland, Minnesota, in probably the year 2005 or so is what I think we've gone back to as the exact date. And it was Christmas Eve and dark and cold. And I think we all know that time of year well. And the snow was blowing across the county roads. And we were turning onto my grandparents' road in Cortland, and our headlights lit up a group of Native men riding on horseback, and it was the Dakota 38+2 Memorial Riders who were riding for their first time to Mankato from South Dakota, the 330-mile journey that they've been taking annually now. And it was their first ride. And I remember being in my parents' car and asking as a high schooler, who's out riding in this cold weather? I was just shocked to see a big group riding through. And my parents said, oh, they're riding to commemorate a war that happened here a really long time ago. And I was like, what war? I just had never heard or been aware of the history. And so it was that moment that sparked my interest. And then that has just snowballed over time into the story.
Right. So can you tell us a bit more about your writing process? So you said you don't consider yourself a writer, but you sat down and you wrote this story and it ended up being a book. So what was a typical day of writing for you? Yeah,
a typical day of writing. Well, I went through kind of different stages of it as far as the research stage, and I wanted to get the accuracy of the timeline so down pat and kind of know all the ins and outs, and then filter what I wanted to actually present in the story. So I worked very hard for a long time. I'd say 6 months of like true full-time research went into the timeline that was kind of the structure of this novel. And then once I got into writing and letting it go and just getting creative and participating in the story and getting into the mind of each character, I would write daily, and I do my best writing in the morning, and I would go to a coffee shop just to get out of the house and get away from the laundry dinging and the dishwasher going off, all those things that happen. And so getting into my creative space and protecting that a little bit. And some days the pages just flow, and other days it's a struggle to squeak out 2 pages that feel like anything of quality. So then I kind of got that first rough draft out and got it all on the page. And then I enjoyed most the editing stage and working with that manuscript and developing it and really painting the picture and having it come to life. And then the manuscript went through a review from a Dakota woman who is a writer, Diane Wilson, and she's an excellent writer who I'm so lucky she took the time to review my book for the cultural components and give me some feedback from the Dakota perspective. And so then I did another pass integrating some of her feedback and a few more rounds of edits. That was just a nonstop iterative process again and again. And each time you think you have it all there, and then you take another look a few weeks later and it's like, oh, there's still more work to be done here. So yeah, I was just being patient with that process and the creative process. And then I started to get some good feedback on the story from beta readers and got it published, and here we are.
Right. Thank you. So as you mentioned, this book required a lot of research to have that authenticity in the setting and the events. Can you tell us a bit more about the research that you did?
Sure. Yeah, I started by reading basically any book I could find or order, or stopped in at the Brown County Historical Society and the museum. I attended all of those events in August, and I think they're going on right now, actually. But those were excellent to attend in some of those lower Sioux community, their events that they held at the same time. Those were excellent. I drove all through the county side of southern Minnesota and stopped at any of those placards or markers that are on the side of a cornfield and have weeds sprouting around the bottom. I would go and visit those. And I looked online at any different message boards or outdated message boards that I could find, like page 10 of people's comments. And even though that's not the actual accurate historical transcript, it's very interesting to see people's thoughts and opinions. And as people discuss the war and their impressions or thoughts on what happened, I found that compelling as well. Obviously, it's not fact, but sometimes that helps just develop the dynamic thoughts around what happened in history. So, I also contacted the Midwankton Sioux librarian and the Lower Sioux community and asked for their recommendations for research and what I could go to for more authentic sources from their perspective and lens, and that was really helpful as well.
All right. So tell us a bit, you have a note in the beginning about Dakota language. So tell us a bit about how that went for you, incorporating that into the book and the way you structured that.
Yeah, so my novel is about the war, and it's told from the perspective of a settler woman and a Native woman, a Dakota woman. And so I do write from the first person lens and perspective of a Dakota Sioux person, which is a culture that I'm not a part of. And honestly, I think our entire American cultural system, it's very different than what a Dakota lens is and how it was in that time, and their spiritual orientation to the earth and life and sense of community and the values they live by. It's a totally different mindset. And so as far as me writing from the Dakota perspective, are you talking about the Dakota language as it's presented in the book, or using the word Dakota or Dakota Sioux?
The language as it's presented in the book.
Yeah, I made a few times I integrate Dakota language. It was the best I could find it in the history books to more accurately refer to certain people or call the chief by his name, to stick with historical record, because I felt like that presented a certain authentic perspective. But in some cases, I didn't integrate Dakota language for the sake of the reader and making sure it was logical and smooth and would flow in the English language that I'm writing from. And so there's a bit of the Dakota language, but it's not in a Dakota language, or it's not back and forth or anything like that.
Yeah, I noticed that there were places where you use the English terms, but the phrasing is obviously direct translation from how the Dakota would refer to something. For example, the naming of the moons and the seasons and things like that.
Yeah, yes, I tried to look into that and make that historically accurate. And some of the trial transcripts and things like that, I used certain language or referred to things in a certain way to hopefully portray that accurately.
So let's talk about the story then.
Yeah.
So what would you say were your biggest inspirations for your two main characters, Wanakeka and Emma?
Geek on Emma, my biggest inspirations. I guess for each one, I wanted to make them women who were trying to achieve their own mission or vision of life or sense of themselves and their values. And so I just tried to think from their own perspectives in their own life experience, what would be authentic for them. And for Onakika, I felt like a medicine keeper or a person who practiced healing practices in her Dakota tribe would have been a meaningful thing for her to be wanting to do and fighting for her own independence and her sense of individuality from her father, who's Chief Little Crow. And then for Emma, she is the settler young woman who's growing up in her family farmstead, and her dad is the part-time country lawyer. And for her, I just thought, what would she have had experience with in her life? And I was thinking about the country schools and how they happened back then, and they happened with kind of intermittent regularity. It wasn't like school starts in the fall and gets out in the spring like we're used to here with an academic calendar, but it was kind of like, could they get staff? Where were people? What was the season like? What was needed on the farm? And so I just thought like, oh, what if she wanted to be in school so badly? And what if she wants to be a school teacher like she saw that one teacher be? And so for her, fighting for her independence and pursuing that dream for herself felt like an accurate trajectory for her vision.
And so as the characters developed through the story, what would you say were important milestones in your writing process as you were watching those characters grow?
Important milestones in my writing process. Well, honestly, like at first, I needed to figure out how to get them close to the action. I knew I wanted two young females like fighting for their own selves. And then as I got to writing, I was like, ooh, how do I get them like close to what's happening? Like these big events, I have to figure out how to make that happen. So that's how I figured out. I was like, oh, I think I'm going to have Onakika be the daughter of the chief. And then for Emma, I came up with this idea of a part-time country lawyer as her father, and that would put her close to the war trials and give the reader a lens on what happened in those that military trial situation and the injustices and the insufficient due process that those Native people got in the trial. So that was kind of a stage of writing, is really balancing out the history and what needed to happen to accurately portray the big events of the historical timeline, and lining those up with the women and their own journey and how to integrate the big moments of their personal life with the actual history and how are those going to influence each other, because both are so important.
Thank you. So what would you say was the hardest chapter for you to write, either getting the words to flow or even, emotionally?
Yeah, emotionally, the hardest chapter to write was the hanging scene that Emma attends in Mankato. And it just was hard to do that event justice, and it is impossible to do so. I could never achieve what I need to. I hope that the emotionality and the meaning and what was lost on that day, I hope the reader feels that in the writing. And it took me a few passes and a few times of giving myself space to get into that mindset and let myself fully feel it. And the one day I was writing and writing and writing, and I was sitting on a couch kind of like this, and I was writing that scene. And all of a sudden my golden retriever got so worked up and ran around and ran herself up on the couch and jumped on me and crawled under the laptop and laid herself on my chest. And I was just like, Charlie, are you feeling this too? And I honestly think that she could just sense the gravity of that feeling within me. And I don't know if I've ever felt something like that around her, and she could definitely sense it in me. So it's kind of interesting, like the power that animals have to tap into that as well. So I'd say like that was the biggest scene and the hardest one to write.
So it's an interesting note you brought up animals, because there are animals in the book. Tell us about what you did to be able to describe, the animal interactions, especially on Akika and horses and so on. What did you do to try to portray that?
Yeah, that was kind of a metaphor, parallel, or symbol I used for power and freedom. especially for Onakika, the power of the horse. And I bring that up in a few scenes and in a few different ways. And I don't want to give too much away. I wish I could speak to one certain thing that happens, but yeah, that's definitely something I thought that she would connect with and that would be accurate for the time too. I was just thinking like their world is so different and than what we're used to as far as technology and our phones and what kind of in our cars and what makes life happen on a day-to-day basis for us. What would have had that significance for her? And I really think animals and the spiritual world and how they're so connected to us would have been important for her.
Can you speak a bit to Emma's relationship with her family? Because that plays a big role in the inner struggle that she has in the book.
Yeah, it does. And it's a complex relationship that Emma has. She has both of her parents at home. They're German immigrants. She has older brother and sister, younger siblings as well, an uncle. I try to just think of German immigrant family arriving to New Ulm and what would their experience have been and her sense of community. And I needed for her to have some things to push against, but I also know what that sense of community, the power it has, and of connection and meaning and belonging. And just, I think a lot of people go through that in their teenage years or their 20s as they're finding their sense of themselves and their profession and how they fit in the world. And especially it's hard for someone that feels maybe a little bit on the outside of it too, where you have so much love, but then you also have your sense of yourself wanting to do something different. And that's a hard space to grapple with. And that's what you'll see Emma face.
How did you come to the ages for your main characters? Like, how did you decide that?
Yeah, that was tricky. At first I had them being a little bit younger. So when you start the book, they're about 16-ish years old, 17-ish. And by the end, they're 18-ish. And I decided that because I wanted them pursuing their own dreams, I needed them to be a little bit older than like a preteen. So that's why I pushed up to those later teen years. And then I was just thinking about the lifespan at that time and kind of what people would have gone through and childbearing years and what society would have been telling a woman then and what an expectation would have been in a Dakota family for a young woman at that age and marrying up and partnering. So that's kind of where I decided that bullseye target was that cusp of adulthood, that coming of age story. And you'll see that happen for both the women in different ways. And romance is just a little bit fun to write and adds a little spark for the reader. So it was nice to have them both find partners that were, and this was important to me as well, that were respectful, strong men that centered them. So I didn't want it to take away from what either woman was on their own journey to do. And I wanted them finding partners of equal value to who they were as women.
They would value them for who they were and help build that up. So,
exactly.
All right. So let's talk about the title. What was your inspiration for the title of the book?
Yeah, the title, I struggled with that for a long time. I knew I wanted something that balanced both women. I didn't want to come out too strongly as just a book about settlers or Little House on the Prairie-ish, or to be too that I was trying to write just a Native American style book or a focus book. And so I was like, oh, I want that balance. I want it to be a little bit feminine. And I just kept waiting and waiting and waiting for the right thing. And then I heard it was on like a documentary about something else that someone said the word dovetails, that dovetails nicely. And I was like, oh, that feels like the right word for me. And it just, if you think about what a dovetail is, it's a splitting or a coming together point. And a dovetail joint, if you make it strongly where it connects, is an extremely strong joint that you can rely on, and a pivotal point and something that you have to craft correctly to make strong. And so I was like, oh, that really fits nicely for what happens for these women. And then the tall grass piece, I thought that just added a little bit of setting for the reader. So that's where it came from. And I like it, and it's a little weird and different. I don't know if people will connect with it or not, but so far I've gotten okay feedback.
It certainly, intrigued me. Like, what is this going to be? It definitely draws your attention. I like that. Now, some of the reviews that they had on the book kind of gave the impression that this might be part of a series. So can you tell us maybe a little bit about that? Or?
Yeah, sure. So I'm currently writing the sequel to Dovetails and Tall Grass, and it's working title is Dovetails of a River, and it's set in 1876 at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. So you'll see certain characters from this story meet again there, which would have been historically accurate, that some people that were at the US-Dakota War of 1862 in southern Minnesota and New Ulm were also present that 15 years later or whatever at the Battle of the Little Bighorn, which was Custer's last stand, that event, and kind of the biggest victory in the Plains Wars, but also kind of marked the end of the Plains Wars. So I thought it was just a nice way to continue, and you'll see why it would make sense for certain storylines to carry on and where that plays out to next.
Great. Well, we'll certainly look forward to that. What do you hope readers take away from this first book, though?
Well, first and foremost, and it's great to talk with you from New Ulm, who's familiar with the topic and the history and the place. For many people that I've spoken with, they're very unaware of the Dakota War of 1862. So for a lot of people, I hope they see how important this time was and what happened and how much the events mattered. And it's kind of lost in history or swept under the rug in some way, or it gets lost in the notes behind, like the Civil War notes. Oh, the Civil War was happening, and at the same time on the Western Front, like it doesn't get its due as far as dialogue and history discourse, as far as I see it. So I just hope people learn about the US-Dakota War. I hope they Google and search and educate themselves about this time in history. And I think part of the message of the story for each woman is to follow your voice and follow your heart, kind of no matter what's happening in the world around you. And I think people will connect with that message, and I hope it encourages people. And also, we're living at kind of a turbulent time in society, and a lot of issues of social justice, and people have a lot of different opinions and reactions, and I don't have any answer to those big questions, obviously, but I hope that my book shows that as you zoom in on certain things, you'll experience things one way, and as you zoom out, you might experience them differently. And both perspectives are important, and all perspectives are important and of value. And I just hope that people connect with the message of that as well.
Thank you. In the beginning, you talked about how you like a good story, and it's one thing to write a history book, which can sometimes be dry and sometimes it has narrative, but to make it a novel, and then to have those two, really great main characters that provide a focus, and they make it personal. So it allows people to really step into the setting and think about, what life was like for people who went through those things. So I'm hoping that people will be able to take some good things away from it. And who knows, hopefully maybe next year when things are commemorated, we could possibly have you come speak at the library. That would be fun too. So thank you again for taking the time to join me today, and we look forward to seeing you again, and look for her book. We'll be adding it to our collection, and we'll see you all next time. So thanks.
Thanks so much.